Last week, on an almost party line vote, Republicans in the House voted to eliminate funding for Planned Parenthood nationwide. So if you or anyone you know has ever gotten a pap smear or a checkup or contraception or anything else at a Planned Parenthood, you have House Republicans to thank for trying to make that go away. Friday's vote is part of a big anti-abortion juggernaut by Republicans in Washington now, who everyone else thought won the last elections because of fiscal issues and high unemployment, but who appear to have convinced themselves that the American people sent them to Washington to make abortion much harder to get, to grow the government to the point where it can insist on its own chosen outcome to your pregnancy, thus relieving you of the burden of that decision, thus relieving you of that freedom. Aside from voting to cut all funding for Planned Parenthood, Republicans in the House are also trying to eliminate coverage for abortions from health insurance policies. They would do it by raising taxes on any policy that covers abortion, the net effect of which would be to likely cause all insurance companies to just stop covering it. Who, after all, is going to choose the raise your tax rate insurance plan specifically to cover something no one ever thinks they're going to need? House Republicans also want to let hospitals and medical providers refuse to perform abortion-related services or even refuse to refer women to places that will, even when the life of the mother is at risk. I recognize you might die because of it, ma'am, but I'm so anti-abortion that I refuse to help you stay alive. It is a difficult position for a movement that wants you to call them pro-life, but House Republicans have decided to interpret the last elections as a mandate from the American people to push for multiple extreme, across-the-board national abortion restrictions, so they are going for it. In 2008, 35 years after Roe v. Wade, 87% of all counties in this country lacked an abortion provider. 87% of counties, no provider. Abortion is a constitutionally protected medical procedure that has been made functionally unavailable in all but 13% of American counties. In part, that is because people opposed to abortion rights have decided to target doctors who provide them, attacking and threatening and harassing doctors so intensely over the years that a doctor's choice to provide abortions is something that takes not just time and training, but a significant measure of personal bravery as well. Legally, constitutionally, American women have the right. Functionally, the intimidation tactics of the anti-abortion movement have made it all but impossible to exercise that right in many parts of the country. And rather than act to protect the availability of this procedure against the movement that has targeted it, House Republicans have decided to pile on, to use public policy in Washington to make it even less available. On the front lines, too, American institutions that in other circumstances would be expected and called on to protect victims of harassment and intimidation, those institutions have been turned by conservative politicians into instruments of just further harassment and further intimidation of those people who are already victims. It's the kind of thing you expect in a place where the government is called the regime, not here at home, not in the American heartland. But that's what's happened. In 1986, a doctor in Wichita, Kansas, relocated his entire medical practice, including his staff and his patients, to a secret temporary makeshift clinic. He did it because his actual clinic, the place he regularly saw patients, had been bombed. So the only way he saw fit to continue, the only safe way to keep seeing patients in the immediate aftermath of this attack on his practice, was to go underground. 5 years after Dr. George Tiller's clinic was bombed and he went underground, thousands of anti-abortion activists from all over the country converged on his practice in Wichita. They spent the summer of 1991 physically blockading the entrance to his practice, preventing patients from getting in to see the doctor just by sheer force of volume. 2 years after that, in 1993, this woman, Shelley Shannon, who had been there at the so-called Summer of Mercy protests in Wichita, she walked up to Dr. Tiller's car in the parking lot of his clinic and shot him. Shelley Shannon did not succeed in killing Dr. Tiller. She shot him in both arms. He returned to work the next day. But the man who would ultimately kill Dr. Tiller 16 years later, the man who'd go on to shoot Dr. Tiller at point-blank range in his church, this man, Scott Roeder, would first pay more than 24 visits to Shelley Shannon while she was in prison. Scott Roeder told the writer Amanda Robb that it was during this time, as he grew close to the woman who had tried to kill Dr. Tiller, that he began thinking about killing the doctor himself. But here's the thing. In March 2009, it was Dr. Tiller who was the one who was on trial. He faced 19 misdemeanor criminal charges, alleging that he had an improper relationship, an improper financial relationship with the doctor who provided the second opinions required by law on late-term abortions. Scott Roeder attended that trial several times. When after deliberating for less than an hour, the jury returned with not guilty verdicts on all 19 counts, Scott Roeder was devastated. He said that outcome, Dr. Tiller's acquittal on those 19 misdemeanor charges in the spring of 2009, he has said that was part of what pushed him to murder the doctor 2 years later.
Did you decide that it was incumbent upon you to do something?
There was nothing being done, and the legal process had been exhausted, and these babies were dying every day. So I felt that I needed to act, and quickly, for those children.
Dr. Tiller and his attorneys at the time were confident that he had acted properly, that they would get a good, fair trial. They had never been all that worried about those charges, those 19 misdemeanor charges. But the anti-abortion movement had seen it as their best chance yet at getting Dr. Tiller shut down. In Kansas, you can convene a criminal grand jury just by getting enough signatures on a petition, something the anti-abortion group Operation Rescue did to start investigations of Dr. Tiller twice. Neither of those grand juries ended up charging him with anything. The anti-abortion movement had tried to get at Dr. Tiller through the legal system, but nothing ever seemed to stick until they got those 19 misdemeanors, those charges that had actually got Dr. Tiller into the courtroom. How can you get from essentially no real results, from citizen petition grand juries turning up nothing on this doctor, to 19 criminal misdemeanor charges that actually forced him into court? It was a long and winding journey, but it all started when you got this guy elected state's attorney general.
Now, any of you heard of George Tiller?
Yes.
George Tiller performs late-term abortions down in Wichita. He has for years.
Another example in Kansas is George Tiller.
Abortionist George Tiller.
I want to first tell you who does not endorse Attorney General Phill Kline. Abortionist Dr. George Tiller does not endorse Phill Kline.
When Phill Kline took office in 2003 as state attorney general in Kansas, he allegedly set in motion a plan to use his power as attorney general to target Dr. Tiller. Today, he stands accused by the disciplinary board in Kansas, essentially the state bar, of ethics violations. Kline and his staff are accused of misleading judges and state officials in order to get information from state agencies and to get medical records from Dr. Tiller. Kline is also accused of lying about what he and his staff were doing with those medical records. According to the complaint against Mr. Kline, what they were doing was comparing medical records subpoenaed from Dr. Tiller's office, redacted records that didn't include patients' names. They were comparing those to records they had subpoenaed from a nearby hotel where Dr. Tiller's patients often stayed. They compared those two sets of records in order to unredact them, essentially, in order to learn the names of the patients. As alleged in the complaint, quote, the document created as a result of this effort lists 221 potential adult patient names, 221 adult patient addresses, street, city, and state, and 221 adult patient telephone numbers. Hey, do you need to see a doctor? Have you considered the possibility that your state attorney general will use the powers of his office to subpoena your medical records if you see a doctor he doesn't like? So then your medical tests and procedures, your diagnoses, your name, your address, your phone number, all end up getting gone through in some state government office somewhere? According to the complaint against Mr. Kline, his staff also, quote, engaged in an effort to identify visitors and employees of Dr. Tiller's clinic by staking out the clinic, following visitors and employees to their vehicles, and recording automobile license plate numbers. As Attorney General Phill Kline tried to use information he got during his George Tiller inquisition to file criminal charges against Dr. Tiller. But the local prosecutor in Wichita, where Dr. Tiller practiced, had those charges dismissed. And then Phill Kline lost his re-election bid in 2006. But you know what? All those medical records, they were still around. And the new Attorney General ultimately used them to file those 19 misdemeanor charges against Dr. Tiller. And that's how they got him into court, even though none of them stuck. Those charges he was acquitted of so quickly in March of 2009 at that trial that was being so closely watched by the whole of the anti-abortion movement, including by Scott Roeder himself, in person, the guy who ultimately killed him. Phill Kline could be disbarred for the way he targeted Dr. Tiller, for the way he conducted his inquisition, for the way he used his office to take the side of the people who had been trying to put Dr. Tiller out of business by any means necessary. Today was day one of Phill Kline's ethics trial in Topeka, Kansas.